if you're going to leave mothers hungry and unable to feed their children, you're going to create social instability, and that's not good. He's also disrupting global supply chains. He's putting the economy on a knife edge. And the S&P 500 is at a level where, I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't have my money in there, and I wouldn't have my money in the UK FTSE 100. And I'm not exposed to markets at present because I don't believe those valuations reflect anything like the economic reality of the world that we're currently living in. People are really still suffering from a cost of living crisis in the UK, and I think many people in the States will be doing the same thing.
So you don't like the US stock market, you don't like the UK FTSE 100 stock market. I take it you kind of like the UK gilt at 5.5%.
I think you'll see a significant increase in the price of bonds as money flees out of stock markets.
Very pleased to be joined by Richard Murphy, political economist, expert on taxation, and emeritus professor of accounting practice at the University of Sheffield. Richard, welcome to Monetary Matters.
Hello, I like the title. It suits me.
I'm glad it does. Richard, you're known as a specialist on taxation. First, can you just share your philosophy of taxation? I think you've been associated with the views that taxes can go up a lot, but then also I think you have a little inspiration from modern monetary theory that budget deficits are kind of natural and can be good. So just explain the confluence of those views there, please.
Look, I'm going to do what a lot of guests on a lot of podcasts do and show you one of my books. This is actually 10 years old. The Joy of Tax. For those who want to discover where it came from, just search another three-letter word ending in X in the English language. I always told my students tax was the most interesting three-letter word ending in X in the English language. And some of them didn't believe me. But, there we go. The Joy of Tax is fundamentally that tax is the most powerful instrument that we give to a government to shape the society that we live in. And if we consent to be governed, and most of us do, I know not everybody does, but most of us actually think that government adds value of some sort somewhere along the line, then actually giving them effective instruments to achieve outcomes is good. Now, you mentioned modern monetary theory, so I will as well. Modern monetary theory is, I know, contentious. I do not ascribe political agendas to it. I just say that modern monetary theory describes how money works in a fiat money economy. And I'm not describing an Italian car, of course, by saying that. I'm actually talking about the fact that fiat means that the government has legally declared that the money that they issue is the legal tender for a jurisdiction, the dollar in the States, the pound, where I'm sitting here in the UK. And they offer no security for that other than their own promise to pay, which is settled by way of accepting that currency as the only means you can use to pay tax. So they spend by creating the money, and every day the Fed creates money for the US government, and every day the Bank of England does so for the UK government. So long as there is a legal budget, which is, of course, highly relevant at the particular moment when we're talking, because you're in government closed down at this very moment when we're talking. That may not last, but so long as there's a legal budget, the government can spend by creating money. Tax then has the role of drawing that money back out of the economy to control inflation. That's job number one. Job number two of tax is to tackle inequality and redistribute income and wealth. And in most countries, that is a role that's ascribed to it. We have broadly progressive tax systems, although in my opinion, not progressive enough, but that's a contentious point with some. We need to reprice market failure. We do so on things like carbon. We do on things like tobacco and alcohol. We tax the bads. We, by and large, try to give low tax rates to the goods. So in the UK, for example, we have low tax rates on health. We have low tax rates on education and on children's clothes for some reason, which is great if you're a woman who's very small because they get away with buying children's clothes. It's possible. My wife does at the age of over 60. So, these things happen. Oddities. But tax does those things, and tax, of course, is the thing that lets the government, more than anything else, deliver fiscal policy. In other words, deciding which businesses to stimulate, which to clamp down on, when to stimulate and when to clamp down. So tax is this enormously powerful instrument, which I'm a great fan of. I actually believe we don't have the greatest tax systems in the world, and that's everywhere. I have just finished producing a series on tax transparency for something called the International Budget Partnership. And this is training material for tax inspectors around the world on how we can improve tax transparency. But anybody can access this free of charge, no less than 32 videos on how to design a better tax system. So you can go and enjoy yourself watching that if you're a real tax geek. But my point is that we need tax systems that are open, honest, transparent, well managed, well delivered, are just, are able to be understood by the taxpayer. And of course, that's quite difficult in some countries, particularly the US. I've read your legislation. God, it makes ours look straightforward, and ours is pretty grim. And we need to actually ensure that justice comes out of it. Now, so tax is, I think, something which is a social good. That means it's something that can potentially improve life for everybody, although, let's be clear, nobody's a great fan of paying tax, but we do, by and large, like what it delivers. We like defense. We like the fact that it does help with medical costs. We like the fact it provides a base level of education for people and so on. These things matter to us. So I think that we have to embrace tax as a positive. And I am very worried that it's too often framed as a negative, when in fact it can do good things. Hence the title of my book, which was a bit tongue in cheek, but deliberately so.
And when you look at the tax codes of the UK or the US, both of which you know very well, what are the most glaring failures that you see?
The glaring failures are twofold. One is the failure to tax corporations sufficiently. I'm old enough to remember when the corporation tax rate in the UK was 52%. It's now 25%. We've flipped the numbers. 52 became 25. We knocked 27% off. Large corporations in the UK are simply not making a sufficient contribution, and nor are they in the States. And in fact, the effective rates of tax are much lower. Now, I've done my bit to try and change that. I wrote something called country by country reporting. I spent a lot of time campaigning against the abuse of corporate tax havens by large companies and created this concept, which became an OECD idea after a decade of work by me in 2015. It's now the law in 70 countries around the world, including the US. And it is raising more tax from large companies because they can't hide their profits in tax havens as easily as they could. So the effective tax rate of many large companies around the world has risen, and I accept responsibility for that. I've never earned a penny out of it, but I accept responsibility for it. The Big Four hated it, and now they all have consultancies selling it and explaining it. I find that very ironic. But the point is that the large companies aren't paying enough tax, and I think they should be paying more because they impose costs on society. Let's be clear, many large companies do that. They impose on us climate change. Now, you can argue whether climate change exists or not. I'm entirely certain it does. I can see the effects around where I live in rural East Anglia in England, and it is obvious that we're seeing very significant changes in the pattern of behavior. And I happen to be an ornithologist, a bird watcher as a hobby, and I can see this happening around me. And I've been alive for long enough to see the changes. And then we can talk about the other externalities that they impose, the things like monopoly profits that they extract from us, the excessive rents that they very often charge people, and on and on and on. So these companies do need to make a better contribution to society. The other group in society who are not paying enough, and I think it's indisputable, are the wealthy. I'm not a big fan of wealth taxes. There's lots of discussion on wealth taxes in the UK at present, and I know that's happening in the States as well. I've seen some of the campaigns and the marches and so on demanding wealth taxes, and I'm familiar with people like patriotic millionaires, some of whom I know in the UK. But I don't think we actually need a wealth tax because I think that there are a lot of inequalities that take place already within the tax codes of both countries and, of course, at state level in the US. Let's be clear. Some of this is very much state level taxation as well in the US. But at the federal level, where we are just not seeing sufficient tax charged on those with wealth, and that needs to be corrected. And the reason why it needs to be corrected is not actually because I'm supposedly pursuing the politics of envy, as some say. I'm done reasonably well in my career. I was a chartered accountant for 42 years. I've been a professor. I've run real companies. I've sold them at a profit. I'm no natural lefty in this sense. I understand how the system works. I understand how to make profit. The reason why is that actually money that is hoarded by the wealthiest is taken out of circulation in the economy. The trouble is, taking money out of circulation in the economy reduces the flow within the economy. We're talking about a difference here, for those who are familiar, between stocks and flows. And a
Mm.
stock of money doesn't flow. It's a balance sheet item. It's not a revenue item. And the more we get the money of the wealthy flowing, which we can do by redistributing it a bit. I'm not talking about taking away everybody's wealth. Let's be clear. I'm not saying everybody who's wealthy should be in poverty or anything else, just a bit. And if we do that, we increase the amount of money with those who would spend every penny of what they got from redistribution. And the benefit would be stronger local economies, greater levels of employment, potentially an increase in wages. But the point is that if you actually get money flowing, and wealth tax is a way to actually improve that circular flow within the economy, you get this beneficial multiplier effect, which delivers real value into the economy. So this is not about taking money away for the sake of it. It's not penal. It's about actually delivering value where value is needed and enabling economic activity where it's desirable for the benefit of everybody, including, and let's be blunt about it, because this will increase profits, those who own businesses. So it's a pro-business, pro-profit activity that I'm proposing. You should always look at both sides of the entry. It's one of my mottos in life. I'm an accountant. There's always a debit and there's always a credit. Which side they are may change depending on where the window is. It's that way at the moment, as far as I'm concerned. My logic of economic analysis is look at both sides of the entry. And if we were to have wealth taxation, we might actually increase the well-being of the wealthy. It's a really bizarre outcome and a suggestion that most people won't make, but it's
Even
how
not
I look
wealth
at things.
taxes, but taxes on wealthy people.
Well, taxes on wealthy people, increasing the rate of tax paid by wealthy people. I mean, if you were really, really keen at the end of all of that, and there would be some people who said the wealthy still aren't paying enough, consider a wealth tax. But frankly, wealth taxes are incredibly difficult things to impose. Who owns it? Where do they own it? What trust, what company, whatever do they own it through? How do you value it? What is that work of art worth? What is that private company worth? What is that racehorse with only 3 legs worth, but great at stud, apparently? Whatever it might be. These are questions which are so difficult to answer that a wealth tax is really difficult to negotiate. And I'll tell you how I know that. I have been responsible for quite a lot of wealth negotiations with the UK Inland Revenue over the years with regard to things like estate valuation or capital gains tax valuations and things. So I know how hard this is. I speak from practical experience. I talk about what can be done, not what would be nice in principle. I'm not interested in those NGOs who talk about what they're, oh, wouldn't it be nice campaigns. That's not where I am. I'm not a headless heart. I'm actually just my head is brought into action here. My experience is brought into play. I believe we could have a stronger economy with more tax being charged on the wealthy, but the wealthy might gain as much as everybody else. It's a genuinely possible outcome.
The theory is that inequality, setting justice and morality aside, inequality by itself is not good for the economy. Like if wealth and income was more evenly distributed, total spending and total GDP, at least in nominal terms, would almost certainly be higher because people on lower incomes and lower wealth have a higher propensity to spend.
Yeah, absolutely. Basic stuff. This is almost economics 101, marginal
Mhm.
propensity to consume. There's a lot about economics 101, which I think is really absolute rubbish. Let's be totally honest. I think many of the assumptions underpinning most economics degrees in every university I've come across, and I have been to a lot of universities in a lot of countries because I've been responsible for research in some EU-wide projects. But most economics is at basic level rather badly taught. But marginal propensity to consume, whilst not a precise science, is undoubtedly true. Let's be clear. I'm not the poorest man in the UK. £1 to me is not worth as much as it is to somebody who only can live on the state old age pension in this country, which is around £12,500, which I do, by the way, receive. I'm a state old age pensioner, but I have other pensions and other income as well. So I inevitably value a pound less than a person who has only got that state basic pension to live on. So every single pound they get, they spend. We just increase the velocity of circulation of money inside the economy to the benefit of everybody. And it wouldn't be inflationary because actually I believe, and I'm certain this is true in the US and I'm certain it's true in the UK, and my mate Danny Blanchflower, who works at Dartmouth College, would agree with me on this, and he's a great Labour economist. He would say we've got massive hidden underemployment in both the US economy and in the UK economy. If only we could release money to those who could spend more, we would have a stronger, more prosperous economy for everybody, top to bottom.
would you want to increase taxes on everybody, just the well-off, or just the extremely wealthy? And what kind of rates are we looking at? I believe the top federal rate in the US is like 39 point something. Are we going to 45? We going to 65?
Look, there's a number of ways in which I would look at how to achieve this goal. First of all, I have a sort of instinctive feeling that 50-50 is as far as you want to go. So I'm not that keen on rates above that. In the UK, we do get to around those, but we actually still give massive incentives and allowances. And the first place I'd start about this is the enormous subsidies that are given to the wealthy through the tax system. So although the tax rate is supposedly 39%, you're getting massive offsets for pension contributions, massive offsets for interest payments, massive offsets for other things that you can claim. And these things, to me, don't make sense. I'll give you an example. In the UK, when I was working as a professor, and I was a higher rate taxpayer, I was a 40% taxpayer in the UK at that point, I was paying into my pension, and I got 40% tax relief on my pension contribution. Now, a senior lecturer in the same department who could understudy for me if I wasn't there to do a lecture was probably earning less than £50,000 and was paying 20% tax and got a 20% subsidy on their pension contribution. Why should I, as the wealthier guy, have got a higher rate of subsidy for my savings when it was already likely that I was wealthier than the guy on lower income? That made no sense. So I would, for example, in the UK, suggest that we should simply be um, having one flat rate of tax deduction for all pension subsidy.
Ooh,
And that would
interesting.
be,
So you want a flat tax on deductions?
I want a flat rate on deductions. Yeah.
Okay,
I
okay, that
also
makes
want some other things which make no sense to be equalized. For example, in the UK, the capital gains tax rate, and obviously there is capital gains in the States, but in the UK, we have a much lower rate of tax on capital gains than we do on income. And I can't see the reason why there's any difference. If I get a pound in my pocket, whether it comes from trading and making a profit on the sale of my investments, why is that any different from a pound arriving in my pocket from work? I don't see the reason why one should be taxed less than the other. I think they're all, at the end of the day, pounds in pockets, and pounds in pockets should be taxed at the same rate. So I would have the same tax rate on income and capital gains. We have a system of, and again, I'm not an expert on the US system here, and I'm not claiming I am. We have a system called national insurance. It's a payroll tax, but there's no equivalent on investment income. But the payroll tax combined rate is 23% at present. So investment income is charged at a very, very much lower rate of tax than is income from work. And my argument's quite simple. They should be, broadly speaking, the same. And at one time, we had a tax which tried to compensate for this in the UK. It was called an investment income surcharge. It was an extra 15% on investment income above a certain rate. So you had a tax-free allowance. So it didn't apply to everybody, just for administrative ease in part. You might say that's £5,000 of investment income a year, £10,000 of investment income a year. At a 4 or 5% rate of return, you've got to have a reasonable amount of money to make a £10,000 in investment income. And that could be from savings, interest, dividends, rents, whatever. But then why not charge that tax so that those people make the same contribution as working people? I mean, the one thing that every government gets into trouble for is failing to deliver jobs. We know the argument that comes out every month in the States about the labor figures. Donald Trump gets very upset about them, I've noticed of late. The statistics and so on are really important. And that number of how many jobs have been added is something that I look at over here to see what's happening in the States. Now, if employment is so important, why are we penalizing it with a higher tax rate than we're penalizing the rate of return on capital? That doesn't make any sense. Even Adam Smith wouldn't get that. Go back to his maxims on tax written in 1776. There's a copy somewhere behind me. It's not an efficient tax. So why aren't we trying to equalize that and create a bit of justice between capital income, which is pretty safe in most cases? Let's be blunt about it. There's not a high degree of risk in most capital income. You can arrange it that it's actually pretty darn low risk. And in fact, labor income, which in many cases is much higher risk, and I often point this out to people,
Mhm.
amongst the people who I know who take the highest risk in any economy are people who actually go and work for someone. I've got a couple of employees even now. they take a big risk on working for me. I mean, apart from the fact they're just working for me, let's leave that aside. But if I can't then employ them, they haven't got a job. That's a very high risk situation. And yet, so many jobs in so many economies, including the UK and the US, are actually people who do work for, the high street store or the small farm or the small business or whatever else, not those big stable companies, which by and large can offer you reasonable stability for life. These people take massive risks, and yet we don't reflect that in the fact that they're penalized with high tax rates, which those who invest to save don't have the same degree of risk. So, I'm just looking again here at something which is pure economic analysis. Where's the risk lying? Often with the labor force, and yet they're being penalized. I don't get that.
So you and your team released a report, Taxing Wealth Report 2024, and you had a series of recommendations, a smorgasbord, let's call it, where you estimated that it would generate 92 billion pounds in revenue for the government. I'm looking up right now. That's slightly more than half of the UK budget deficit. So is your goal there to decrease the budget deficit the UK has, or are you trying to lower taxes on lower income folks, or increase government spending on social programs?
I'm not trying to reduce the UK government deficit because I haven't got any concerns about the level of the UK government deficit. There's a big demand at the moment for UK government bonds. The government's able to sell every bond issue it's got. The affordability of the interest is really quite reasonable. The overall rate compared to GDP is totally manageable. The interest rate itself is pretty okay and could be reduced by the Bank of England whenever it wanted if it wished. So I'm not worried about the deficit. In fact, we're selling many more bonds under our quantitative tightening program than we need to. So the market, the demand for bonds is there. No, what I'm trying to do is lay out an option that if governments insist on saying they've got to balance the books, and our governments do, that's what they say. I don't actually agree they do have to balance the books. I think they have to balance the economy. And in this instance, I follow John Maynard Keynes, who says basically balance the economy and you'll get the taxes right. And I agree with him. In other words, we should be aiming to actually put people to work and use the resources we've got to best effect. But if you want to raise more tax, what I'm saying is here are a range of options, none of which hit ordinary working people. And ordinary working people, if you hit them with tax, aren't going to vote for you, and therefore you're not going to be in office. So this is an agenda for you to use that, first of all, lets you balance the books. Secondly, gives you a wide range of choice because nobody would probably want to do all these things. I think that would be incredibly unlikely because I don't think any government needs that amount of money in the UK at present. And thirdly, basically lets you actually do something which would be intensely politically popular, because I'm aware that a lot of people in the UK think that the wealthiest people in the UK are undertaxed. So it is a popular political agenda for those who are actually trying to balance the books, whether they need to or not, but also not get themselves voted out of office in the process. That's what the whole logic of the report was.
Thank you. So you mentioned the UK budget deficit. You don't have concerns, and that the market is buying all of the bonds that the government
Or
is issuing, as well as that the Bank of England is selling from quantitative tightening. The yields have increased. I actually did an interview. I was surprised to learn that the 30-year yield was 5.5%. Not terribly high, but certainly higher than it's been after the great financial crisis. So it appears that the enormously large demand for sovereign bonds, UK, Japan, US, appears to have been moderating relative to the supply. And Richard, I just want to, share where I agree with you, which is there's been a ton of, doomsday people about the debt. And basically since 1970, or really since 1980, debt as a percentage of GDP has gone up and skyrocketed, hence the concern. But yields have mostly gone down,
yes,
except from 2022. So I just want to share that I agree with you there, but share your view on why yields are rising, as well as your reaction to the argument that yields are rising because there is a concern about the budget deficit, or inflation, or the government being too easy with its deficit and spending.
oh, look, I can explain why yields have risen in the UK. It's incredibly easy. We have a totally incompetent Bank of England running interest rate policy in the UK. That is the beginning and the end of the story. First of all, they didn't understand what caused inflation in 2022. They didn't understand that if you have an external supply shock created by reopening from COVID too fast, you will have supply chain disruption, and that will cause inflation because people who have had to compulsorily save, basically in 2020, 21, will try to spend money as fast as they can, and that's what they did. And there wasn't the means to spend it because supply chains were disrupted. And they didn't understand that if we had a war declared by Putin on Ukraine, and therefore there was a threat to a number of key supplies, including gas and oil, but also wheat and fertilizers, which are much less publicized in Europe. But Ukraine is the source of 20% of all fertilizer, for example, used in the whole of Europe. Then that is going to cause stress, and market traders priced up all those products. In fact, within a year, all those products had returned to pre-war prices. And that's the point. The inflation which the Bank of England reacted to by increasing interest rates was actually very, very transitory. The oil price, the gas price, the wheat price, the fertilizer prices all reverted to the mean, as is normal, of course, within a very short period of time. And you will see that after an inflation spike, there's in the past a deflationary episode. We don't get deflationary episodes now, but we go back to the mean. And the mean is a couple of percent or so. That would have happened but for the Bank of England. They force up rates. The base rate here is now 4%. The impact of quantitative tightening, which is a deliberate policy of bond sales to increase the interest rate to supposedly control inflation, is to add another probably 0.7, 0.8% on the top of the base rate overall as impact. So we're really seeing 4.8% of our interest rate being driven effectively by the Bank of England. Whereas, as you say, after the global financial crisis, the rates were much lower. Well, so was the base rate. It was 0.5%. Unsurprisingly, as a result, the market rates were lower. In fact, the correlation between market rates and the Bank of England base rate are incredibly close. The real rate of return at the moment on these bonds is actually really quite modest over what you could get by, well, simply putting money on deposit if you're a large organization. So there is no real interest rate crisis. What we have is a Bank of England who are refusing to bring rates down to where they should be. And I welcome the fact at the moment that there are one or two members of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee who are recognising that, including some who I wouldn't have expected this from, like Catherine Mann, who's normally a hawk but appears to be a dove right now, which is quite odd. So I just blame utterly incompetent monetary policy. We don't need to have rates this high. We don't need a quantitative tightening program. There's no reason to sell these bonds. They should have been cancelled. The whole of the QE, QT process was a complete accounting farce. I've done the double entry and shown how it was quite ridiculous. There was no economic substance to it, but we've had an overhang, which has been very costly as a consequence. And I just think we need to get our heads together about how we properly integrate fiscal and monetary policy. I don't believe that we should have independent central banks. They were a farce from a period of time when, frankly, long past, 30 plus years ago. And I remember it well. I remember it being introduced. But I now keep on having to remind myself that at the age of 67, I talk to people who can't remember that there was an economy before the turn of the century, many of whom are actually now in quite serious positions within it. And they don't remember why we got independent central banking in the UK, which was merely an incoming Labour government who wanted to tell the world we're not going to be irresponsible. So they created this thing, and now we've got the legacy. It is a massive impediment to effective economic policy in the UK. Whether to merge the Fed and the federal government is a different question at the moment. And I understand why, in a sense, Trump wants to merge the two, but I don't think he's a great economist, and I don't think he's driving a great economic policy. But in
But it
principle,
appears that on the subject of interest rates, you and President Trump are somewhat aligned in that they should be lower.
yeah, rather oddly, yeah, we're aligned. Yeah, I would definitely say that we should be seriously lower. The UK should have a base rate which is under 3% at present. And if we did, what is more? And let's be clear about this. What is more, if we cut the base rate, we would also cut the inflation rate. Because in fact, the base rate, UK base rate, is reflected in a large quantity of prices in the UK. Lots of the time, 90% of all vehicles in the UK are leased. The price of that lease, of course, includes interest. But that interest element is included in the inflation component that goes straight into the calculation of the retail price index. And that's true of a great many products which are sold with some form of credit arrangement inherent within them. Mobile phones are all sold on leases in the UK. They have an element of interest charged in them, and on and on. Rents in the UK are a significant factor in the household economy of many younger and or poorer households, and they are directly related to the base rate. People want to recover basically their base rate borrowing cost in the rents they charge in the private sector in the UK. If you brought down the base rate, you'll bring down the inflation rate. But that is something they don't seem to understand. This debit and this credit, what's the cause, what's the effect, what's the double side of the entry, is something that appears to be beyond the ability of a lot of economists. They should learn some accounts before they become economists.
And so what's your you said you weren't concerned about demand driven inflation in the UK. We had a huge supply driven inflation with natural gas and oil, as you said, in 2022. It declined, but it has been on the the March higher. Now it's 3.8%, close to 4%, and the low it got, I guess, for 1 month it was lower than 2%, but it didn't appear to stabilize. And also, I should ask you, what rate of inflation to you is too high? There are people who say there should be zero inflation. The Federal Reserve says there should be 2% inflation. I actually don't know what the Bank of England's target
2%.
is, and 2%.
2%.
Okay, and do you think it should be higher?
I think we should be decidedly flexible about this.
Mhm.
I think we should be grown up. I've never known a business that says we must have a profit margin of 30.3% GDP, gross margin, or we must have a net margin of 8.5% before tax. This is just ridiculous because you can't manage to control an economy like that. Bumps happen. They're reality. There will be disruptions, as there were, as I said, in 2022 or thereabouts, major disruptions for external events, which nothing the Bank of England could have done to change. Changing our base rate had no impact upon Putin, and it had no impact upon the supply of fitted kitchens from the Far East, which was one of the reasons why prices apparently went up, or the supply of cars, which were in short supply at the time. This is just crazy. So why are they going up again at the moment? There is the end of another period of correction going on in the UK economy. Wages have caught up with what they lost, by and large. We have had a period of wage correction. So that people lost out a lot during the COVID era and immediately afterwards, and the inflation that happened. And for the last couple of years, we've had above inflation pay rises, and that has given rise to a little bit of inflationary pressure as a consequence. I don't doubt that. I don't dispute it. The underlying trend in wages is, I think, going down at present. I'm quite sure of that. That's what I'm hearing in the street. I do a lot of walking around and asking people. Again, I refer to Danny Blanchflower, but we both talk about doing the economics of walking about. My most reliable indicator within the economy is my barber. I mean, he doesn't have a lot to deal with, but I still go and see him.
He's got a fair amount.
Yeah, there's enough left. There's a lot of guys my age with a lot less than I've got. He's incredibly useful for the information he picks up from the local economy, but I do that with other people as well. I talk to the baristas. I talk to all the people around the town. When I go somewhere, I often listen and talk to people. Sometimes even butt into conversations because I learn so much by what people are saying. And what worries me is that the real economists, the people who sit in ivory towers, don't do this sort of thing, don't learn what's happening on the street. And when you listen to the street at the moment, there's definite fact that wages are coming down. The thing that is worrying everybody is that food prices are still rising, external shocks, which the UK is still doing nothing about because we left the EU, and that's why our food prices are higher than the European Union's are. We still have these massive barriers to trade between us and our nearest neighbours on whom we're totally dependent for some products. We just can't buy them. We can't grow them in the UK. We can make wine in the UK, and some of it's really good, but it's in tiny, tiny quantities. So we import it from all over the world, including California, but an awful lot from France and Germany and elsewhere. These things we don't have control over, and these things are causing us inflationary risks. What's the ideal rate? Look, I don't care whether it's 2%, 3%, or 4%. I think within that range, and I would really quite like to have what was once called, this is taking me back until the 1990s, maybe even earlier, the European exchange rate mechanism in the 1980s. You probably don't remember that, Jack.
Before my time, I've read about it and heard about it, but yeah, no, not
Absolutely.
yet.
We had a thing called the snake in the tunnel. And the tunnel was the upper and lower band of acceptable rates. And you were allowed to snake your way through the tunnel. Let yourself have a bit of a movement, free movement. Why have a fixed target? We don't even know why we picked 2% any more than anybody in the European Union knows why 3% was picked as the target for fiscal deficits. Nobody has a clue why that number is sacrosanct. Heuristics have their role in life. I'm a great believer in heuristics, rules of thumb, for those who are not familiar with the term. But they've got to be flexible. Everybody has to have a moment when they think, I've got to use my judgment here. If you're going to crash into the Hudson or try to fly to an airport the other side of it, you overrule all the rule book and land in the Hudson, if that's the way you're going to survive. And you do the same with the economy. You actually decide what's best for this moment. And that means you don't stick to the rules on every occasion.
You mentioned the European Union's budget goal of a 3% budget deficit or less. So I think people hear a budget deficit and they think automatically it increases the debt, and of course it does. But it can debt as a percentage of GDP can go down. So if the debt is growing as fast as the economy, debt as its GDP should stay constant. So what we've had since 1980 is not just an increase in the absolute level of debt, but an increase in debt as a percentage of GDP. And as you know, Richard, tons of people wringing their hair out in 2009 saying once debt as a percentage of GDP hits 90% or 95%, it's going to be Armageddon. There's going to be a disaster. That hasn't happened.
Well, of course, their spreadsheets were wrong. Let's remember their spreadsheets were wrong. Rogoff got all that wrong. But yeah.
Yes. And in the US, we're at about 120%. I actually don't know the UK figure, but debt as a percentage of GDP has increased. So, is there any limit to the debt as a percentage of GDP? You're not concerned at 120%, I assume now. Are you worried at 140%? Are you worried at 240%, 340%? Is there a limit to debt as a percentage of GDP? Because it certainly has gone farther than a lot of people could have thought possible.
Look, I'm not worried about it so long as you actually, again, look at it intelligently. And I really do mean that. Because after all, let's just look at the corporate world. And I spent a lot of time, most of my life, in some way managing or advising corporates. I mean, before I became an academic, that's what I was doing. And the point I'm going to make is that if we took on borrowing in the corporate world, we did it for a reason. We didn't do it to actually fund losses. It wasn't a great way to borrow money by and large. We actually did it because we were going to invest. If you can identify that you have a massive deficit of assets that you need to actually make your economy work better, and that your economy, in fact, is going to have declining GDP unless you invest now and borrow to do it, why wouldn't you borrow? In the UK, we have a deficit and a backlog with regard to asset replacement. And we have the most massive problem in the UK that 85% of all insurable properties in this country, which can be used as the basis of bank loan portfolios, are going to be underwater within 50 years at some time in the year, which basically makes them utterly uninsurable and therefore collapses the entire City of London and our banking system. Now, do you take on debt to actually sustain the viability of the UK banking system and all the transaction base for all of our economy into the future, let alone also, by the way, keep a lot of people in their homes and a lot of businesses functioning as a sideline, saving a massive amount of repair cost along the way? Or do you just say, we can't afford to do that, let's leave it, let's go? No, we actually, of course, should be investing. We should be looking at the asset. We should be looking at the long-term value that the investment creates. To just come up again with one of these silly arbitrary numbers, it's a percentage to GDP, is absurd. Not least because, and let's be clear about this, GDP in this sense is a revenue flow figure. It's a very bad revenue flow figure. Go and have a look at what Robert F. Kennedy said about this in 1968, shortly before he was shot. His speech on GDP was one of the best commentaries on the subject ever made. It values everything that is unimportant in life and nothing that is important, is a synopsis of what he said. But when it comes down to GDP, it is a revenue figure, but you're measuring debt to revenue. But you should be measuring debt to assets because that's the proper relationship within the balance sheet. The trouble is, government accounting is so absolutely dire. In most countries, we don't even have government balance sheets to actually reflect the fact. So we have a deficiency of good information. What's the right answer? Look, Japan manages with well over 200%. Is that right for us? Probably not. Is that right for you in the States? Probably not. Why? Because you have a different savings logic to what Japan has. And I'm not saying that Japan's situation is replicable either in the States or in the UK. But if you can make the case that there's an asset to invest in and the yield from that investment is a good one, why wouldn't you want to invest? What we need is politicians who understand how to make the business case, set out the scenarios and say, this pays us a rate of return and we're going to do it for that reason. But we don't. These people have never written a business plan. They've never written a cash flow projection. They've never done a discounted cash flow. They've never done an IRR, whatever it might be, however you're going to sell the proposition, even, damn it, a payback, if that's what you want to do. And the point I'm making is that because we don't have financially literate people, either in most of our treasuries, let alone in our political parties, we're not getting an educated discussion on debt to GDP ratios because we're coming up with meaningless numbers. Let me just give you another example. In the UK, people think that the figure for GDP at the moment is around 2.9 trillion pounds a year. Almost 300 billion pounds of that is made up of rent supposedly paid by people like me to live in my own home, and I don't pay rent to live in my own home. This is
Oh,
a
owner equivalent rents? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they are deemed rents to provide a comparison with the German economy, where most people rent and don't own. Now, this is just absolute fabrication of data. I mean, it's fraudulent if if a multinational company did this, it would be fraudulent. So
Yeah, I would
we
say it's
really
not even fraudulent. Fraudulent means it's an artificial protection of reality. There's no reality to misrepresent here. It's completely fake.
Yeah, absolutely fake. Absolutely
Yeah.
fake. So we're even coming up with ratios with numbers that are themselves meaningless, and yet we're claiming we're going to manage the economy on the back of these. My appeal, and this is perhaps why I bring a multidisciplinary approach here. I'm not an economics professor. I was a professor of political economy, but that requires you to be pretty conversant in political theory and economic theory. And I'm also an accountant. Bring those disciplines together, and you get a different insight. And that's the point I'm making here. We aren't actually comparing apples and oranges. We're actually not even comparing apples and bananas. We're comparing apples with make believe. Fairies at the bottom of the garden. Paul Krugman once said that there was the leprechaun economy in Ireland, which was made up by those little fellas at the bottom of the garden. He was saying that the Irish GDP figure is absolutely fake and it's worse than most countries. And he's right. We're making up nonsense numbers and then saying we've got to comply with them. No, let's be mature, grown up, and analyze the data better. And if we analyze the basis for incurring debt better, actually made the case we're going to buy hospitals, we're going to buy roads, we're going to replace bridges. And God knows, every bridge I've seen in the States in the last few years, whenever I've been, scares me rigid. The amount of concrete that seems to be falling off bridges all over the place just frightens me. There's nothing like that in the UK. And I think we've got some pretty bad infrastructure. This stuff, if you invested in that, then you would be making a gain for the future and passing on worth to the next generation. And let me just tell you a little story about the national debt. The lucky children will inherit it. We always have this story, oh, our grandchildren will have to repay it. No, the lucky grandchildren inherit it. And the person who knew this before anybody else was Jane Austen. Now, I don't know whether you know Jane Austen's novels. She wrote 6 novels: Emma, Persuasion, Pride and Prejudice, things like that, Northanger Abbey. I did actually once get challenged by a group of very sort of interesting women when I was going to talk about wealth taxation at the World Bank that I had to do so in the context of Jane Austen's novels. And they told me 15 minutes before I went on. Thankfully, I know Jane Austen's novels well enough to be able to do this. And the audience was perplexed until I admitted that on the third reference that I brought in, that this was to fulfill a promise that I'd made to them that I'd do it. If we go to, I think it's Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice. The mother could tell the worth of the prospective suitors for Elizabeth Bennet on the basis of their ownership of UK national debt. That was the measure of wealth of these men. Darcy had £10,000 in the 4%. He was a man of substance, as well as being Colin Firth walking out of a lake, which apparently made everybody swoon throughout history. But the point is that we understood that then. She understood that. Government debt is private wealth. What we have to do is find the right balance between how we put wealth to use in the private and public sectors to create an overall pattern of growth which benefits us all, including the owners of private wealth.
So I agree with you that GDP can be misleading, particularly in the case of banking and banking-driven real estate booms like Ireland, you mentioned, also Iceland, and maybe also China. Richard, looking at the government balance sheet, the government borrows as a return on investment, that can be a helpful framework. But is there a danger? Because I totally yield to you. Borrowing in the U.S. at a 30-year yield at 5%, borrowing at 5% to build tons of bridges and roads and tunnels, or to fund a lot of science and scientific research, or to build solar panels, or many other things, have a very high rate of return, much higher than 5%. But is borrowing at 5% to a 90-year-old person to make sure that they live to 92 and very expensive? Like, I think that we should do that, but I don't think that the IRR of the rate of return of that is high.
No,
We should do
no, no,
that
no,
not
no.
because the rate of return is high, but because it's the moral thing to do. But like, I think a lot of the government budget, particularly like spending on elderly care, Medicare in the U.S., does have, purely economically, like, a pretty low rate of return.
Absolutely. Look, I don't dispute that.
Yeah.
It does have a low rate of return. I mean, it's just a question of, do we value our grannies or not?
Yes, I agree.
Um, and I don't have any grannies left. I don't even have any parents left. Between my wife and I, we are now the top generation of our family, which is kind of scary, kind of odd. I don't feel very old very often, but that's one of the things that reminds me of it. My son has a nasty little line which he says, "Dad, you've got to be nice to me. I'm going to choose your care home," which I think is quite funny, really. He does too. But the point about it is that obviously those things are not good. But I remember when I mentioned this book, The 6 Reasons for Tax. One of them is to just ensure that we redistribute income and wealth to ensure that we at least can have a base level. And let's go back to do a little bit of theory here. Jeremy Bentham came up with the idea of utility. The philosopher based at University College London, in the late 18th, early 19th century. He still sits there, by the way. He's mummified and he still attends meetings. It's really rather macabre to see him sitting in the corridor, but you can. And Jeremy Bentham came up with the idea of utility, which is a pretty meaningless concept in its own right. But he never talked about distribution. So he didn't worry about whether all utility in society belonged to one person or it was spread evenly. But as I've just explained a little while ago, if we spread it more evenly, we get higher economic multipliers. And even if you redistribute to a 92-year-old, the 92-year-old has a very significant economic multiplier effect. Because the one thing that they do is not buy capital goods, they actually buy revenue goods. But what they buy is care. And what that means is that there's a job for the carer. But more than that, the carer is now paying tax, quite possibly, and paying a social security contribution of some sort, quite probably, and is maybe claiming fewer benefits, quite probably. So you can't yet again look at the first order impact. You have to look at the second order impact. So keeping a granny alive isn't just a matter of feeling like we shouldn't put grannies on the street and let them die, although I've heard people tell me that. It's actually about how we build a fully caring economy that actually does pay for itself, because the multiplier effect from that spending doesn't come from keeping granny alive. It comes from the impact of granny's spending on the economy. And granny is most likely to spend on immediate consumption, either on food and in the local economy or on care, which also feeds into the local economy and frequently keeps people, frankly, out of trouble, whether it's economic trouble, social trouble, or whatever other trouble they might get into. Because this is a rate of return on investment which is reflected in greater social cohesion. Now, how do you measure that? You have to come up with measures to do these things. This is not beyond the wit of good economists and good accountants to actually measure the impacts. But it isn't a first order effect. And that's my point yet again. Measure the debits, measure the credits, and imagine what they are as you go along. What's the ripple effect? Economics has an obsession with equilibrium and static systems. If you read a book by Schrödinger, the physicist, published in 1944 called What is Life? He talks about entropy and equilibrium. And equilibrium is death. Equilibrium is the point that you get to when there is no further change possible. And in life, that is death. And he reckons that equilibrium is the one thing that we all want to avoid always. And yet economics has made this idea central to the way in which it manages the economy. It's absolutely absurd. What we want is a dynamic system, one where actually we embrace change and entropy and allow for it, but defer death for as long as possible. That's what most of us want to do. So economics has all the language and all the thinking role. What we're trying to do here is keep Granny alive, not just because we care about Granny, but because Granny also helps others live well. And we have to think that way.
So 10 years ago, you wrote a book called The Joy of Tax, and you wanted to boldly reimagine a plan for taxation. And you had a lot of proposals about ways, innovative ways that the government could raise revenue to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars, of dollars or of pounds. 10 years later, Richard, I have some good news for you. I have maybe, from your point of view, maybe some less good news. The good news is that that has happened in the States. The less good news, maybe from your point of view, is that they're called tariffs, and they tax imports into the United States. But they have appeared to be quite successful in raising revenue to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. Your thoughts?
Have they been successful? Most of them aren't really in operation as yet. I mean, there's all sorts of questions. The amount of revenue coming in, I mean, Trump has, at the time we're talking, not been in office for 9 months yet. You don't normally measure the effectiveness of a tax change in matters of months. Many of these are still subject to some forms of legal review. Many of them aren't bedded into systems as yet. And the economic impacts of these have certainly not flowed through into the economy as yet. Whilst we've seen, for example, I think in the States so far, the large car companies, by and large, trying to absorb the impact of tariffs into their price mechanisms at the moment to create continuing demand for their product. They're not going to be able to do that forever, not particularly when we're seeing the rates of tariff being imposed on Europe, on Mexico, on China, and so on. And the States does not and is not capable for decades of making all its own cars. It might never make all its own cars. We're seeing tariffs on things that the States can never create. I think that 90% of your tomatoes come from Mexico, and yet there's a tariff on them now. Well, why? Why did that make sense? This is going to feed through into inflation. Worse, it's going to feed through into inflation that has the biggest impact, of course, on those who are on lowest incomes. And they will not be happy. Why do you want to make those people who are the most vulnerable in society unhappy? Because they're the people who tend to have least to lose by getting angry. So, as a politician, I wouldn't want to do that. I know Trump is very worried about security and stability inside US cities, but if you're going to actually leave people hungry, and in particular, if you're going to leave mothers hungry and unable to feed their children, you're going to create social instability, and that's not good. So I believe that the fact that tariffs are deeply regressive taxes, having relatively low impact on the very wealthy and very high impact on those who are on lowest income, is a cause for social instability, which is going to give, in the longer term, massive headaches to Donald Trump and his economics team, because people are going to realize that this is not actually a tax paid by people outside the US. It's a tax paid by them to the US government, and other people, the wealthy, are not paying anything like the same amount. And that is going to cause him social stress. I don't know how he'll manage that, but that's what I predict. I can't see a way around that. We know that these taxes cause stress. We know that VAT, value added tax, which you don't have, but which 154 countries around the world do have, is a source of potentially very large social stress if it fuels inflation. So, no, I think he's made an unwise move with regard to tariffs, and he's also disrupting global supply chains. He's putting the economy on, a knife edge. And how, in this situation, markets are worth what they're currently trading at. The S&P 500 is at a level where, I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't have my money in there, and I wouldn't have my money in the UK FTSE 100. And I'm literally living my talk here. I'm not exposed to markets at present because I don't believe those valuations reflect anything like the economic reality of the world that we're currently living in. As I mentioned, I do the economics of walking about a lot. I hear what people are saying. And people are really still suffering from a cost of living crisis in the UK. And I think many people in the States will be doing the same thing. But those people I speak to give me that feedback. If that's the case, then those market prices are out of touch with reality. We've already talked about GDP potentially being out of touch with reality. Well, the current boom in prices, might reflect, FOMO, the fear of missing out. But I actually prefer the idea of JOMO, which is the joy of missing out. I'm very happy to sit out this boom because I think there's going to be a bust. That's my own personal opinion. It's not investment advice. But, this is an unsustainable situation. Tariffs, artificial share valuations because of an AI hype. I've lived through this before. I've done the dot-com boom. I've done booms before that. I remember the 1987 crash very well. And these things all look to me to be on a cycle and we're due another bust. It's a long time since we had one. It's over 15 years now. I just can't see how we're not going to have an economic downturn. And I have no idea how Trump will manage that. And I have no idea how tariffs will help that. In fact, I can tell you with certainty they won't. We will need a changed economic policy from the states, amongst others, to resolve this. And if we're going to recover from a crash, which I think is pretty inevitable, we're also going to need a change policy from the states so that we can actually rely on the dollar as the reserve currency again. And that at the moment is at risk. People talk openly about alternatives, not because they want to, because frankly, the dollar's done a useful job for 75 plus years as a reserve currency ever since the Second World War, but because they don't know whether they can trust it now. And these are massive economic problems that we haven't got answers to at the moment and which we're going to need answers to.
So you don't like the US stock market, you don't like the UK FTSE 100 stock market. I take it you kind of like the UK gilt at 5.5%.
Well, look, there's a potential capital gain in the UK gilt as far as I'm concerned at the moment, because in fact, I think interest rates are going to fall. The current yield is okay, but let's be clear, bond prices and interest rates are run inverse to each other. So in fact, actually, UK bonds are underpriced at the moment, and I think there will be a flight to bonds in due course, and I think you'll see that in the States. I think you'll see a significant increase in the price of bonds as money flees out of stock markets at some point. And of course, when the tipping point happens, how it happens, when it happens, I don't know. I'm not suggesting I do. These things always happen at moments we can't predict. October is often dangerous, is all I can say. 29, 87, both of them were pretty bad. And actually, of course, 2008 was a pretty grim month. I wrote my way through it on my blog, the Funding the Future blog. You can see I read a lot of blog entries that month, not as many as I do now because I'm retired. But, I did write a lot
You wrote
about,
7 today.
yeah,
You wrote
7 this
7
morning.
today.
I'm a man who can write 3 or 4 blog posts before breakfast without even having a cup of coffee first. That's what I do to wake myself up in the morning.
That is a good skill. Richard, my final question is on tariffs. Trump shocked the world and markets and economists in early April with his very high rate of tariffs announced. As you know, lots of delays in the implementation, tons of exceptions like the U.S. tax code, as well as realized rates or real rates likely going to be much lower. Part of the reason I think why the U.S. stock market is up. Earlier you mentioned Rogoff, but actually I think Kenneth Rogoff, economist, actually mentioned to me that a dirty little secret among economists is that raising tariffs from 2 or 3%, where they were before Trump, to 10% wouldn't be that big of a deal. Do you agree with that? And do you think if Trump tariffs end up being moderate in the 10 to 15% range, that it won't be that big of a deal and we could avoid those highly negative scenarios you talked about?
As I say, I'm pretty sure that for him, it's not a big deal. Why? Because I'm pretty sure that Ken Rogoff has got enough money to be able to withstand the impact of a 10% tariff. I think he can buy another car if he wants to, irrespective what the tariff rate is going to be and how much it's going to impact upon the overall retail price that he's going to have to pay. So he's in that group in society who are pretty indifferent to this. But there's a lot of people in the States who are not indifferent to this. And ultimately, the wealth of those who are indifferent is dependent upon the spending power of those who aren't indifferent. And you can't actually live in a society and pretend that you are not dependent upon the spending power of those who are lower down the order than you are. And I think that's, I'm afraid, what I think he's saying. He's not measuring the potential consequence on an economic downturn resulting from tariffs across the board in the States. And I think that that is where the problem is going to be seen. There are going to be major impacts on lower income households who are simply going to be under even bigger stress than they are already to just not make ends meet, but put food on the table in front of hungry children. And mothers who can't feed their children are pretty wild in my experience. So I really don't think that's a good idea. I think you really need to think about that one. And I'm afraid to say, I think that whilst his models might say this isn't a problem, I think he should get out and about and talk to a few people again, do the economics of walking about. He'd find out that that doesn't quite hold up in the same way as some of his economic models in the past haven't either. Sorry to get that little jab in there. But no, this isn't a real projection. It's not even a valid opinion, in my opinion, because it's based upon the position of comfortable America. And the position of comfortable America isn't the position of all America.
Thank you very much for coming on, Richard. People can find you on Twitter at Richard J. Murphy, and your YouTube channel at Richard J. Murphy, where you post a lot and have a lot of very compelling videos, which have a large viewership, larger than mine. And we'll link to that 2024 tax and wealth report, as well as your blog, Funding the Future. Thank you, everyone, for listening. A reminder to leave a rating and review for Monetary Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This closes the door.